Social media has come a long way over the past decade and has been a valuable resource for communicating with others instead of in person. Its value only increases as the times go on, and even more given the global pandemic. So much so that social media has seen a 46 to 51% increase since the start of the pandemic, according to Business Insider. However, despite it being such a good tool for communication, how is it that social media can create so much loneliness and isolation? The reason for such is that social media creates a false sense of reality for its users, it intentionally warrants social media addiction, and creates a detached emotional barrier due to the lack of personal interaction. We see social media platforms such as Instagram and Snapchat, which are fixed to let users put their life on display and provide what social media is meant to do, which is to replicate. Social media represents a false sense of reality and serves as an escape from the real world. Constantly being on social media not only detaches you from the present, but it makes you feel like you're living in someone else's life. The problem with this is that people only want to show you what they want you to see, and they showcase their highlights rather than their failures. And that false perception of perfection can cause an overwhelming amount of self-consciousness and alienation. Platforms that are typically derived of pictures as opposed to text, such as Snapchat and Instagram, in contrast with Twitter and Reddit, which are more text-based, actually cause an increase in isolation in relation to their counterparts. University of Oregon professors Matthew Pittman and Brandon Wright have observed that the simulation that photo-based platforms give are actually stronger than those of text-based platforms and can cause more distress on one's mental health. While being able to communicate through photos may provide more intimacy, people are less likely to feel lonely if they aren't replied to on Twitter than on Snapchat because of that exact intimacy that's involved. Being able to see others went somewhere and didn't invite you has more effect on someone's mental health than not getting a message back. Reich and Pittman have detailed that users end up using photo-based social media to compensate for a lack of offline relationships, and that users share photos to gratify needs such as affection, attention-seeking, and disclosure. They want to live in a world that is not their own and can often find themselves lost within their own online persona. This lack of self-actualization can be damaging and, like social media's intent, creates a false sense of reality. Now, you would think that if social media allowed us unlimited access to each other, how could it still cause loneliness when people are just a message away? Who cares if people simply post what they want others to see? How can social media have that much of an impact? Well, most of this has to do with how corporations market and target their audience. And it's been proven that an extended use of social media will directly correlate to isolation. This comes as a result of these companies trying to appropriate their app to accompany your likes and dislikes and draws information reading your habits. The goal is to keep you on their app for as long as possible and creates a thirst for wanting to stay on. In fact, studies have shown that the longer that you do stay on, the less happy you will ultimately be. And when we look at major social media platforms such as Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and Facebook, their primary objective is to keep you there, scrolling and scrolling. And many times we can often find ourselves there for hours, but on average, they do a pretty good job on keeping their daily user there on time too. Here, let's take a look.
Here, we see that Instagram users are spending an average of about 28 minutes per day on the platform, and Pinterest users too are spending an average of 14.2 minutes, and over half are there for a specific purpose. LinkedIn users as well amass over 50% of all social traffic related to business or advertisements. And with Facebook's 2.41 billion active monthly users, about 74% of them use the platform for an average of about 38 minutes daily.
Now, let's dive into the math behind the correlation of longer social media usage and loneliness. When you interpret the data by isolating only one dependent, which is social media anxiety, you will see a slightly larger standard deviation, arithmetic mean, skewness, and kurtosis, telling you that the bell curve is more right down. This is still a reliable representation that social media influences anxiety and its other factors. A skewness value closer to 0 tells us that the bell curve will be symmetrical And with symmetrical distribution, the data is more predictable and increases the efficacy of the hypothesis. As you begin to introduce more factors, such as social anxiety, happiness, and loneliness, you will see that the data still stays consistent with our initial interpretation of only one variable. When all four factors are introduced, the standard deviation decreases from a 12.31 to a 3.19. And when there's a low standard deviation, the data is clustered more closely together, giving us more reliable data, as well as proving that there is positive correlation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Though the skewness may be more right down than we would like or have predicted, it still shows us that there is a direct relationship between our variables and proves that social media does, in fact, influence anxiety, loneliness, and happiness. When we examine the results holistically, we can see that there is a positive level of interaction between the social media addiction and social anxiety, with an R factor of 0.427. And keep in mind, the closer it is to 1 means that the variable absolutely influences the other. When we examine the data shown in Table 2, When we examine the data shown in Table 2, it is evident that all of our coefficients are positive. This tells us that the mean data is increasing along with the average amount of people addicted as well. If the average is increasing, then there are more people addicted. You can also predict that if you were to introduce more variables, that the mean will also increase based off of the data. And for those that don't get the math behind it, basically, an increase in social media use leads to an increase in loneliness, an increase in social anxiety, as well as a decrease in happiness. Looking and analyzing the data shows us the mathematical reasoning and correlation to social media and loneliness, and how these interactions are almost counterintuitive. The more time that you spend on social media, the less time you get to spend with someone in person, and as a result, the lack of personal interaction keeps you from that happiness. Surprisingly enough, despite all this, people still choose social media as their preferred form of communication, as proven by a recent Stanford study and survey. As we can see on this pie chart, we can clearly interpret that 90% of people prefer social media over other forms of communication, such as emails, phone calls, or even face-to-face interaction, which combined only equates to the other 10%. Now, as a result of this lack of personal interaction or personal communication, a detached emotional barrier starts to form from communicating solely over the internet. This barrier blockades your emotional attachment or emotional responses over the internet, and what had once satisfied your social media need then simply will not anymore. As smartphones, such as the iPhone and others, were introduced back in 2007, we have actually seen a 65% decrease in people actively committing to live engagement.
With it being 73% in 2007 to only 8% as of 2016, in accordance to the 2019 study by the American Psychological Association and New England Journal of Medicine. And even despite live interaction being less prevalent, it is more effective in preventing miscommunication, appropriating conflict resolution, and an overall satisfaction than its social media/virtual counterpart.
People are so caught up in the convenience of social media that they avoid live interaction, but the lack of live interaction is what has them on social media in the first place. And so, we've seen that social media has grown into something beyond our control. As much as we would like to just turn it all off, the thought of missing out somehow is worse than the use of social media itself. Rather than contact people face to face though, people simply find social media more efficient and simpler than taking the time to meet with someone. The convenience of social media being a click away from our smartphones is dangerous, because too much time on social media will have you trapped within its realm of deceit, as it creates that false sense of reality. More than this, however, its intentional purpose of keeping you on its app or site is intended for addiction, leading to loneliness and isolation, as we've seen. Your brain's natural reaction is to set an emotional barrier towards relationships built online, so as to not get hurt when social media is already a coping device for not engaging in live interaction. This paradox-like effect of users wanting to interact with one another, but not in person, but not wanting to feel lonely, is a total anomaly that has since caused many to research and determine the correlation between social media and loneliness. Now, the question arises, how can this change? How can we utilize one of the greatest inventions of the modern era to be used proactively and for our own well-being? The change starts with you, and the change starts with us. For us to choose not to care what others post, and to use social media as our advantage, not our addiction. Thank you.